How does this sound?
Sounds good. There's a lapel mic if you prefer that too.
It's
Or
all
like
right.
a-
As long as you can hear me when I'm not by it.
I think you'll probably be all right. Yeah. You'll be louder when you're closer to the podium.
All right, everybody. Hi, welcome to Department Seminar. My name is Terry, and I'm Seminar Chair for this semester. Before we get started, I wanted to make a quick announcement here. The AMS officers are throwing a fall barbecue tomorrow from 4:30 to 6:30, and this usually takes place on the rooftop, but this year it's going to be along the green space by the AOS loading dock along Orchard Street, and there will be vegetarian options. So this speaker today is Benji Johnson. He's going to be presenting his work on the, I know I'm going to butcher this, Laurentian Great Lakes and their lasting link with climate. And yeah, their lasting link with climate. Benji's a graduate student in the professional master's program. He double majored in atmospheric and oceanic sciences and environmental studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2021. His interests and hobbies include meteorology, biosphere interactions, environmental history, charcoal illustration, playing the piano, retail investing, watching SpongeBob, and sharing experiences with others. So, take it away, Benji.
Well, thank you, Terry. I want to preface this by saying I gave a version of this presentation last spring, although it was online, and I did want to give it in person because I think that would be more interactive and more engaging. And I did alter it. The idea of this presentation is that I wanted to synthesize peer-reviewed literature with my own experiences. So a lot of the pictures in this presentation are my own, including this one. Love the Great Lakes water. So I grew up in Minnesota, and I'm very grateful for that because I had a nice outdoor, laboratory to juice up my curiosities. And so this presentation at many points might seem broad, it might seem simple, it might seem overly complex in some parts, but I hope at least you all walk away with a renewed appreciation for the Great Lakes and our landscape in general, because there's so many layers of our landscape that we often overlook, but they all tell a story. And so that I hope to convey to you guys. So I want to first give you an overview of the Great Lakes. We have Superior, Michigan, Huron, Ontario, and Erie, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And then here's a little depth map of the Great Lakes. You have Lake Superior by far being the deepest and the largest Great Lake. It is the largest body of fresh water on Earth in terms of surface area. And then we have Michigan being a little shallower than Lake Superior, and then Ontario a little shallower than Michigan, Huron the next, and then Lake Erie is a puddle compared to the rest. Lake Superior at its deepest point, just north of Munising, Michigan, is 1,333 feet deep. So that's very deep. That's, I guess if you put the Sears Tower in that trench, it would be approximately the same depth. So the Great Lakes are not in isolation. They are part of a very large chain of fresh water that is of great importance to the world. And so these stretch from northwest Canada to central and eastern Canada, and then the Midwest and northeastern United States. Great Bear Lake, Great Slave Lake, Lake Athabasca, and Lake Winnipeg are also some of the largest freshwater lakes in the world. And so first, I want to, because this is a talk about climate in the Great Lakes and the effects that has, but we want to start with the past climate, the climate of the ancient Great Lakes, and what caused the Great Lakes to even form in the first place. And so the first thing that we have to turn to is looking for evidence of glaciation, because these are large freshwater lakes that the water originated from precipitation of some kind. The main lesson here is, like I said, our land is a historical document, and that today's landforms inform us of yesterday's climate. And so we're going to look at the land around the Great Lakes, and that's going to point us to the history of the Great Lakes themselves, because the Great Lakes and the land around the Great Lakes are very intertwined. And if we learn a little bit about the land around the Great Lakes, that'll tell us about the Great Lakes themselves. Glaciers have a profound impact on the land, and so like I said, the land surrounding the Great Lakes can be used as a proxy for understanding the Great Lakes themselves. This is just a quick overview of some of the features that on the landscape a glacier can cause, but we're going to dive into that shortly. So now if you will indulge me, if you want a Milky Way, take one, pass it around. This is gonna hopefully teach you a little bit about glaciers. If you don't want one, that's okay. But they are good. Milky Way, one of my favorite candies. So, anyways, once you get one though, if you do get one, I want you to open it. And if you want, this is extra credit, take a bite out of it. But I want you to tell me what makes a Milky Way like a glacier. So that hopefully this will wake you up. I know it's already like the afternoon, but maybe some of you woke up a little later. But I do want to hear from some of you. What makes a Milky Way like a glacier? You'll get another Milky Way if you do speak up.
Distinct layers.
Distinct layers, that is a good one. Anything about the shape of it, perhaps? Or anything about the layers that can speak to how a glacier behaves?
There's a nougat layer.
A nougat layer? That's perfect. I was going to talk about the nougat layer. Anything else? We have a caramel layer.
Layers of different densities.
That is good. That is good. And then the shape. I'll point out the shape. This is a little bit of a stretch, but it is a U shape in terms of a flat bottom. But what I want to make clear is that, so yes, it is flat bottom, which is U shape in a sense rather than V shape. It has an elastic interior, so you could talk about that in terms of the plasticity of a glacier, in that they're very mobile. They can stretch, deform, and do all sorts of things. They have a crusty/cracky top, so if you were to bend the Milky Way, it would crack on the top, kind of like a crevice in a glacier. And then the nougat, as Noah Chen pointed out fantastically, it represents all the till of glacier transports. I would have done Snickers because Snickers, rocks. I mean, there's no rocks in Snickers, but there's peanuts and stuff. And that would have been, glacial erratics and stuff like that, but, peanuts. So nougat is the till of glacier transports, dirt, sediment, and all sorts of things like that. In Scandinavia, there has been a wealth of research as far as glacial impacts on the land. And it makes sense because Scandinavia was a subject of heavy glaciation in the last ice age, as we're going to see, the upper Midwest. And so this diagram was made in 2013 by Fredin, a Norwegian researcher. And so he looked at time scales and the features that a glacier can cause. So on the very short time scale, you get microerosional features, glacial striations, cracks, frictional caused by friction, cracks and stuff like that. As you get into 1 year, 10 year, 100 years, you'll get ice dammed lakes, moraines, drumlins. Drumlins are a ground moraine feature. And then in a very long time scale, you can carve out fjords, U-shaped valleys. So Norway is known for their fjords. U-shaped valleys we're going to see are actually present in the Great Lakes region. And cirques. Cirques are more confined to mountainous regions, but nevertheless, they take a long time to form. So, being from Minnesota, I just want to focus on Minnesota for a minute. We're going to see so much evidence, it's overwhelming evidence of glaciation in really in the blink of an eye in the recent past. The glaciers that receded from our land were not expected to be older than 11,000 years or so. That's when they receded from this landscape, and so we are really just on the coming out of the ice age in many senses. So, like I said, many features in Minnesota. This same guy, common features in all glacially scarred landscapes are microerosional features or landforms such as glacial striae. So I'll call them glacial striations. I took this picture in Duluth, Minnesota, in Brighton Beach Park, which is one of the many beautiful parks on the lake shore of Lake Superior. And notice a few things. One, this is an incredibly smooth slab of rock. So that's interesting. But at the same time, there's visibly scratches on the rock. They're not deep scratches right here. In some places they can get deep. See that in Ohio, places like that. But these are micro-erosional features. And so it almost looks like somebody took chalk and went across it. And so the idea behind this is that as a glacier moves, it picks up all sorts of debris, rocks, very abrasive things on the bottom of it, and it's so much force, right? Downward directed force that the glacier imparts on the land, and it's actually making these marks on the rock faces, as well as overall smoothing the rock face itself. One of the main reasons why we can directly attribute that to glaciers is, look at how similar this looks to the last image. This is a picture I took in Alberta, Canada, near the foot of a receding glacier. It was actually the Athabasca Glacier. So in mountain glaciers today, you see the same thing, glacial pavement with glacial striations. So it's a remarkable similarity. This is a look at that Athabasca Glacier. The U-shaped valley, very noticeable. Another thing is the glacial erratics. Like I said, glaciers can pick up rocks, in some cases as big as a school bus. I mean, there's no real limit to how big of debris they can pick up. But what they'll do is, when the glacier melts, it will just leave whatever it was carrying on its back or inside or underneath on the ground where it was. And so they'll be very out of place. You'll get boulders like this across the glacial landscape. And often over areas where other bedrock is exposed, smooth, but with singular boulders just laying right next door. So this is in northern Minnesota. So smooth rock faces with erratic boulders are an excellent indication of glacial activity. That's another example of glacial pavement, just a remarkably smooth slope. So now I'll bring us down to the Wisconsin border. The Dells of the St. Croix. This is a pretty interesting region. It is an area of exposed basalt because it was a part of that mid-continent rift that occurred a long time ago. So a lot of volcanic, igneous rock came up and was exposed. But we're not really going to focus on that. We're looking for evidences of rushing torrents of water because that can be attributed to glaciers. So I said to myself the day that I took this picture, this is probably like January 2020 or December 2019. I said the St. Croix has never been this peaceful. That's dramatic, yeah, but there might be some truth to that because what this landscape is hiding, it's very serene, is a very violent past. And we're going to take a look at that soon. As the Fredine study alluded to, meltwater features from glaciers can be just as influential, if not more influential, than the ice itself. This is a very unique phenomenon that is not found many places on Earth, but these are called glacial potholes. These are big, open areas in the ground in basalt, in very hard rock, that go down hundreds of feet in some cases. There's one in Minnesota called the Bottomless Pit, and people don't even know how deep it is because it hasn't been excavated because it's filled with sediment, and they're often filled with water, in this case ice, in the wintertime. But these are very deep holes in the earth. And remarkably, as our Norwegian friend pointed out, I mean, here's an example from Norway. There's a striking similarity to our example in Minnesota. In 1965, a researcher named Dahl attributed this to large amounts of meltwater, which is also something that Fredine examined. And ultimately, what causes this? Well, you can either get this far away from a glacier just because of large amounts of meltwater, or you can get this on the underside of a glacier if you have a river flowing under it. But you'll get rocks and debris that spin down. It's like a vortex, and they'll really drill down like it's a power tool into these rocks, into the bedrock, and it's remarkable what they can do. So I want to ask another question to the audience. You look at a topographical map of Minnesota. What do you notice? What do you notice when you look at this? Just anything that pops out. There's many things, but I'll point out two things in a sec. Yes, Megan?
You kind of see the driftless area where the glaciers didn't fit.
That is very interesting, yes. When you lack glacial till, you lack glacial drift, you'll end up with what is a stream dissected landscape. So you get V-shaped valleys, as opposed to, in many places, it looks a little different. But yes, Jack?
It looks like there's a difference in topography, like where a river run is versus
That's really interesting. Do you know what this river's called, Jack?
No.
Okay. This is the Minnesota River. But where's the Mississippi River? What? Can you even see where the Mississippi River is? It's almost shocking how much more noticeable the Minnesota River is compared to the Mississippi River, which goes like this. But why is that? You're probably saying, you know, I thought the Mississippi River was supposed to be this great river. It is a great river, but the Minnesota River has a much more storied past. And we're going to talk about that in a sec. Fun fact, actually, the only true gorge along the entire Mississippi River is right after where the Minnesota River joins it, just for a little bit around the Twin Cities, and then it flows all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. So, one, we're looking at this very flat region by the Red River along the border with North Dakota. And then, yes, we're looking at that Minnesota River in the Minnesota River Valley. Because this is a remarkable feature. Why is this such a deeply incised, why is that such a deeply incised river? You don't hear about the Minnesota River much. At the end of the last ice age, as glaciers were melting, they formed large melt puddles. And these puddles existed in lakes such as Lake Agassiz, which at the time were bigger than any lake on Earth today. I mean, these are massive lakes. And we can see the ancient shorelines of Lake Agassiz in places like northwest Minnesota. And the lake floor of Lake Agassiz is what caused such flat terrain here and here. This is now a very poorly drained area known as the Big Bog. It's one of the largest intact peatlands in the world. And actually Woodland Caribou used that landscape in the 1920s and 30s to escape wolves and humans, but we'll talk about Woodland Caribou in a little bit. And then notice this right here. So the idea here is that as glaciers receded, this would be a terminal moraine. They melted and they filled up these basins, these lake basins, with water. And then at some point, we're going to see that this dam, which is what a terminal moraine functions as, failed. And so large amounts of meltwater, which I did talk about a second ago, would rush down into what was called the ancient River Warren. Now it's called the Minnesota River. And that's why you have the footprint of a much larger river than what it is today. Because today, the river is only a trickle compared to the valley that it suggests. So like I was saying, you have a receding glacier, it melts into liquid water. The terminal moraine the glacier caused by pushing all the sediment at some point might fail, and you'll get a breach of that, sending meltwater rushing through to, in this case, the Minnesota River. So this is what the Minnesota River looks like, this is what the Minnesota River Valley looks like today. Remarkably flat, not fat, well it is wide, but remarkably flat, broad. And yeah, I grew up 5 minutes away from the Minnesota River, and I always wondered, why is the valley so big? The Mississippi River in Minnesota is nothing like this. It doesn't have that broad of a valley. And then why is the river itself so small? Only in years where you have tremendous snowfall and spring snowmelt do you actually flood even a greater portion of this river valley. It never actually fills to the brim, but what this suggests is that at one point it did fill to the brim. But that's a lot of meltwater. So actually the corollary between today's spring snowfall melt causing the river to rise is basically what happened in the past, because you had melting glaciers bringing up the water level and causing this great valley. So today you get bison. Nice. The little bison are called red dogs because they're red. They're reddish in color. They used to roam over the plains by the millions, hundreds of millions in some estimates. They're nearly hunted to extinction. As we know, today they are on the rebound. It's a pretty great success story, actually. So one of the main features of Minnesota also is the amount of inland lakes. I would say probably if not number one, it's in the top few reasons why these lakes exist is because of ice chunks that were left behind by the glaciers, and then form what are called kettle lakes, because these ice chunks that are left behind make a depression, or they melt into their depression, and they become little lakes. This is actually not far from where my grandma is from, Alexandria, Minnesota. Beautiful, yes. Glacial activity, yeah, highly likely. Kensington runestone though, maybe, big maybe. But what this is a great example of is not only a rich native prairie, this is actually a great example of mid and tall grass prairie, but it's a kettle lake, which are very numerous over Minnesota. You know, it's called the land of 10,000 lakes. But we actually have strict standards compared to Wisconsin, so it has to be at least 10 acres large to be considered a lake. Unlike Wisconsin, you say, oh, we have 15,000 lakes. No, because you can consider like a drainage pond a lake in Wisconsin. Anyways, kettle lakes are not the only way lakes are clued past glaciers. Moraines can also make lakes, and a good example lies in New York, which is also a good example of a U-shaped valley. So when glaciers move over a landscape, they take advantage of existing indentation, so that might be a V-shaped valley caused by a stream or any sort of drainage. And then, like I said, it dams a terminal moraine creates a dam, and then the meltwater and rainwater will fill up these lakes, and you get Seneca, Cayuga, and all the fingered lakes in upstate New York. And like I just showed before, here's a glacier caught in the act of scooping a U-shaped valley today. So today's Great Lakes are the remnants of yesterday's larger glacial lakes like Agassiz, and those glacial lakes formed as a result of melting ice caused by warming temperatures. The potholes we looked at were forced by meltwater from lakes like glacial Lake Duluth, and evidence of the large ancient lakes like Agassiz can be seen in the old shorelines, the beaches, the ancient beaches we find in northwest Minnesota. Obviously, ice sheets and glaciers require cold temperatures to exist and persist, so that means it's a surplus of snow in the winter, which doesn't all melt in the summer. So they had to have been growing up north for them to advance to the Midwest. Gravity and the pressure gradient, their own weight of themselves push them southward. But here's why it's not so easy to know how much colder it was exactly during the last ice age. We rely on climate proxies. Of those, you might know about pollen cores. Pollen cores are when you go to a lake bed, and you plunge a core down and you analyze different pollen from different species. So if you have, let's say you have a layer of oak hickory pollen or something, that means it was a warmer, drier climate. If you have a layer of spruce pollen, that indicates cooler and moister. We also have ice cores that look at different isotopes of oxygen in places like Greenland. The problem with these is that they yield a result that's highly localized, and we're going to take a look at that in a second. And then we're going to also take a look at this study that was done by Bintanja, or maybe Bintanha, in 2005. They constructed a model that relates sea levels within the past 120,000 years, which is when the Wisconsin period of glaciation began, roughly. And the mean surface air temperature for land masses above 40 degrees north in the northern hemisphere. The problem with this, we'll take a look in a sec, but this doesn't account for seasonal fluctuations, precipitation, differences between North America and Eurasia. And so it's hard to get, it's hard to say exactly, how much colder was it in the last ice age. It's not an easy answer. So like I said, pollen proxies can be taken. There's a famous example in southeastern Minnesota called Kirkner Marsh in Rosemount in Dakota County, which is where I'm from. But they compared it to Wolf Creek in central Minnesota and Lake of the Clouds in northeastern Minnesota. And it gives you a hint at the types of environments they grew in because of the different types of pollen. You have pines, you have populus, that I'm assuming would be like aspen and stuff like that. And then you have oaks and other things and like that. The problem with this is that, okay, so now we know that it was colder in northern Minnesota and a little less cold in central Minnesota and then the warmest in southern Minnesota. But these locations are really not that far away. And of course, vegetation is kind of a finicky proxy. So they look at ice cores in places like Greenland, and so they mapped out the change in temperature. You can see a little jump there at the end, but back to around 12,000 years ago, which would have been at the heart of the last ice age. A little after that, the ice would have retreated. The problem with this is that they do. This is actually an average of multiple locations in Greenland. So you get different answers here, because here this is suggesting a nearly a 10 degree drop. But then you look at the study that I was just mentioning a little bit ago, they averaged a 7.25 degrees Celsius drop in the last ice age compared to today. The problem with this is that since they developed mean air temperature for just the land masses above 40 degrees north, that doesn't account for fluctuations between North America and Eurasia. Because if you consider the same mean surface air temperature, they then simulated how much the ice coverage would be. And the problem with this is that in the normal case, the ice coverage over North America is far less than what observational data on the ground suggests, because we can see, the Kettle Moraine in Wisconsin, we can see glacial drift, recent glacial drift in places like Indiana. So what they did is they said, well, what if it was, in this case, what if it was colder in North America versus Eurasia, considering the same mean air temperature? What if it was even more cold in North America compared to Eurasia? That would mean it's warmer in Eurasia. And so the trouble is that you don't get consistent stuff between the observational data on the ground and then the data they derive from this model. So that's why it's a little tricky. But overall, we can assume that it was much colder in the past ice age, at least 7 degrees Celsius colder for the northern hemisphere's land masses. So I want to talk about how the Great Lakes influence the climate today. This is the Duluth Breakwater Lighthouse. This is beautiful. Those are nice clouds. They're on the opposing shoreline. That's actually Wisconsin's shore. Highly recommend going to Duluth. Duluth is a great place. Scott and Huff in 1996 did a comprehensive analysis of climatological data in the Great Lakes Basin. Ultimately, all of these effects are due to the lake's tremendous heat capacity and their ability to provide the atmosphere with moisture. So they said, logically, near Lake Superior, the biggest and deepest Great Lake, the greatest lake influences existed there. We're up to 100% more precipitation falls downwind of the lake in winter compared to what is expected without its presence. And during summer, all lakes cause a downwind decrease in rainfall of 10 to 20%. That's also a function of the lake's tremendous heat capacity, because they remain cool in the summertime, which would act as a stabilizing influence for the atmosphere, because it would create sort of a marine layer that would inhibit rising air. Mean minimum temperatures in the basin are higher in all seasons over all lakes, another function of their heat capacity. Lake-induced reductions in mean maximum temperatures in the region are observed during spring and summer, so it stays cooler in the spring and summer because of the cool water. There is a pretty significant effect on cloud cover during the winter, downwind of Lake Superior in Michigan, and that shows increases of approximately 25%. Conversely, in the summertime, Lakes Michigan and Huron reduce cloudiness roughly 10%, and like I said, that's probably a result of the stabilizing influence the lakes provide in the summertime. So now we're going to take a look at, by the way, this is in Grand Marais, Minnesota. This is called Artist Point. If you walk around there, it's beautiful. But we're going to look at climatological data for two different points. One will be on the lakeshore. One will be away from the lakeshore. We're going to not far away from the lakeshore though, and we're going to see how big of a difference that the lake brings to their climate. That's me as a little kid. Some more nice flat bedrock. Anyways. Okay, so that was Grand Marais. This is Ely, so this is more of the Boundary Waters region. Reindeer moss, white pine, canoe, water. Beautiful place. This is true boreal forest. So, I mean, as the crow flies, obviously Ely would be much closer than 107 miles, but this just gives you an idea of location-wise. Look at how significant of a difference the lake brings to the Grand Marais climate, which is on the shore. In the winter, it's much warmer than Ely. Ely is one of those regions where last winter, in some of the lakes near Ely, where you get them in some of the low depressions, Snowbank Lake hit negative 50 degrees, well, at least negative 50 degrees for like 3 or 4 days in a row during the previous winter's cold snap. If only that happened in summer, that'd be crazy. But then you see a change. In the summertime, as the lakes remain cool, it brings Grand Marais cooler as well. Grand Marais does not average a day. There is no day where the average temperature in Grand Marais is above 70 degrees in the summertime. And that's a little crazy. But it happens. I mean, you only get temperatures that average over 60 for like 3 months, which is the entire summer season. And then in Ely, though, you routinely get into the upper 70s. It often gets into the 90s at some points. So extreme, and also I will note, you get a wider diurnal variability in the inland location because you can release so much more heat in the nighttime and retain, or you can heat up the dry land so much easier in the daytime as well. Like Scott and Huff alluded to in their study, there is a difference in precipitation just between these two areas that are, one is on the lake and one is away from the lake. In Ely, in June and July, this is when you have the highest chances for precipitation in Minnesota because of summer thunderstorms and whatnot. You got a much higher chance of getting rain than Grand Marais because Grand Marais is stabilized by the lake. But in the wintertime, look at how Grand Marais has a higher chance of daily chance of precipitation than Ely. So that also suggests, that also points to what Scott and Huff examined there. Now we're going to look across the lake. So we're going to look at an upwind location and then a downwind location. Grand Marais now still, but with Houghton, Michigan, which is on the Keweenaw Peninsula in the middle of Lake Superior. Obviously, as the crow flies, like I said, it's much shorter, but it is still across Lake Superior nonetheless. And you still get exactly the effects that Scott and Huff pointed out. Here we go. This is what really is important. Look at how much they match up in the summertime as far as chance of clear skies, because Scott and Huff said that there was a Lake Superior, the Great Lakes increased the chance for cloudiness in the wintertime by a significant degree, and you can see that right here. The chance for clear skies is roughly the same in Grand Marais and Houghton in the summertime, but in the wintertime, I mean, you're almost doubling the chance for clear skies in Grand Marais compared to Houghton because you're getting so many clouds from the lake. We're going to talk about that in a second, but this is a pretty key observation. By clear skies, they mean clear, mostly clear, or partly cloudy. Less than 60% of the sky is covered by clouds. The same thing is seen for precipitation. So in Houghton, when you get cloudy skies in the wintertime, it's often accompanied by lake effect snow. However, in Grand Marais, you have a little bit of a higher chance in June and July when you get summer thunderstorms. This, by the way, this is in liquid equivalent precipitation, but monthly snowfall is tremendously higher in downwind of Lake Superior than it is upwind. Chicago and a western suburb, very close by, but once again, Chicago has limited diurnal variability. They're kept warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer compared to Aurora. Same thing. And this is a little tricky because Chicago isn't necessarily downwind of Lake Michigan, but you still get a higher chance of precipitation in the wintertime in Chicago and lower in the summertime. So it still matches that. We're going to look at Cleveland and a city just south. Once again, limited diurnal variability in Cleveland. Higher chance of precipitation in the wintertime, lower chance of precipitation in the summertime. So why is this? Well, if you have a relatively warm lake in the wintertime compared to the air temperature, you get cold air blowing across it, you get an upward heat and moisture flux from the lake. The longer the fetch, meaning the more time it has to flow over the lake, the higher capacity you have for snow. If you get frictional convergence, you can get an orographic enhancement downwind the lake, that encourages more precipitation, more snow to be juiced out of the storm. And this is all very shallow. This is only a few kilometers max in the very lowest level of the atmosphere. So it's a very shallow phenomenon. You can get thermal convergence bands from the shores that are normal to the direction of synoptic flow. That results in a long lake axis parallel band. You see this in Lake Erie and Lake Ontario a lot. Oftentimes in Lake Superior in Michigan, you get the horizontal convective rules that are that are mostly wind parallel, that are not like the long lake axis parallel band. But this is, I mean, you can see if Grand Marais is right here and Houghton is obscured by clouds there, it's easy to see why Houghton gets much more cloudy skies than Grand Marais and more snow. And you can see where the snow belts are. Unlike the regions that, like in the regions in the Keweenaw Peninsula or the Allegheny Highlands of Pennsylvania or the Tug Hill Plateau of New York, you can, like I said, squeeze out a lot more snow. Because of that, you can average over 200 inches of snow in a season. This is a really important map to me. Well, it's an important map to our lives, whether we realize it or not. This is from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This maps average annual extreme minimum temperatures, meaning in any given winter, how cold does it normally get in the winter time? And what's striking here is that you can see so clearly the effect of the lakes. You know, people consider, oh, Michigan's so cold, you know, who wants to look? It's pretty mild actually when you look at the areas upstream of it. While northern Minnesota averages annual minimum extremes of negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which is equivalent to portions of interior Alaska, Michigan's Keweenaw Peninsula averages annual minimum extremes of negative 10 to negative 15 degrees Fahrenheit, which is equivalent to portions of central Missouri and northern Kansas. And where Lake Michigan's western shore constitutes hardness zone 5, so do regions in central Tennessee and the northern Texas Panhandle. So the lakes provide such a moderating effect downwind that it's really crazy, and this has tremendous implications for the life that lives there and what can be grown, and because this is used mainly for agriculture, gardening, whatnot. You want to see, you know, if you're buying plants from Home Depot or wherever, you're looking at the hardness zone. Can it survive well in my zone? What minimum temperatures can it withstand? So I'll zoom in here on the Great Lakes region. You can see just tightly along the shore how much warmer it is downwind of Lake Michigan, Erie, Ontario. This is why Door County produced 1/10 of the entire nation's cherry crop at one point, and it's still a chief grower. This is why orchards are so prolific in western Michigan. This is why people go to Traverse City and the Old Mission Peninsula to drink the wine and shop the shops, and you know, and because of the moderating effect of the lake. If the lakes were not there, Traverse City would not be known for its wine or its summer tourism in the way. I mean, obviously, but yeah. So it does have a big effect. It's a multi-billion-dollar tourism economy there, and just in the Traverse Bay region alone. And as you can see, also downwind of Lake Erie in Ontario, you get more orchards. This is an interesting thing as well. Because of the cooling effects in the summertime that the lakes bring, you get what are called disjunct communities. So these are holdovers from past glacial times, and it actually provides more evidence for past glaciation because of the fact that they're there away from their continuous ranges. In many cases in the Arctic tundra or the Mountain West, these are Arctic and alpine disjuncts. But also you'll get animals like woodland caribou that exist in disjunct populations. You probably don't know when you're standing in the UP of Michigan that in some islands across the lake, woodland caribou still roam those islands, and that's kind of crazy. Animals like deer like to winter near the lakeshore. There's so many things that deer do to their environment and to other species like moose and woodland caribou, but we'll not get into that. This is a picture of one of the last caribou ever seen in Minnesota. This was photographed in the 1980s in Cook County by a DNR guy. And in one of the winters here in the 80s in northeastern Minnesota, you still had woodland caribou coming down. And they have not been seen since. They're not doing well in Canada either, for many reasons, most likely development, habitat fragmentation. But these animals, which used to live in northern Wisconsin as well, in the UP of Michigan. Even portions of northern lower Michigan, they're now all gone from our region. They're functionally extinct in the lower 48 states. And so that is interesting, but at the same time, because of, not only because of some of the moderating effects of the lakes, but the isolated nature of the islands in the lakes, there is kind of still a game of chess really between the wolves and the caribou, because there's a lot of pressure from First Nations people and local communities to keep these caribou alive. But when you get a winter that freezes over the lakes that connects the islands to the mainland, wolves follow the caribou. And caribou are very defenseless. They're not really good at defending themselves against wolves. They only do well when the density of wolves are very small. But in the absence of wolves, they grow exponentially. They like this habitat, and they do fine. So what they've done in the past few years is try to transport caribou from wolf-infested islands, basically, to islands without wolves, in the hopes of trying to keep them going in the Lake Superior region. But it's been hard. One potential silver lining, I mean, this might be a stretch, but one potential silver lining of a warming climate with reduced lake ice is that wolves won't be able to colonize these island refuges as easily. People might wonder, well, what about their habitat? Can they handle the warming climate? Turns out they actually are more adaptive than people used to think. The convention was they rely on lichens covering the trees, old growth boreal forest, but they've done well on lots of the hardwood covered islands in Lake Superior. They actually have a higher tolerance for heat than moose do. Moose enter heat stress when it's only about 14 degrees Celsius, and then caribou don't enter heat stress until it's 35 degrees Celsius, so that's about like 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So they are not as affected by heat so much as they are by habitat loss and predation. So, like I said, the lakes provide moist, cool microclimates, and these microclimates create microhabitats. Given and Soper did a really great job of analyzing where these Arctic and alpine disjunct species could live, and what they discovered was that they tend not to be in places where the midsummer surface water temperatures exceed 59 degrees Fahrenheit. So obviously, if surface water temperatures do rise substantially, that would jeopardize these alpine and Arctic disjunct communities. This is an example of one. It's northern paintbrush. It's found in one county in Minnesota, rare, and then one Keweenaw County in Michigan. It's also rare there, and its nearest populations are all the way in the Black Hills and Rocky Mountains. So, I mean, obviously at one point they weren't disjunct because in a past cooler climate they would have been continuous, but only after the climate warmed did they hold on to these niche microclimates that the lakes provided. But they're in trouble because of potentially much higher surface water temperatures. On the left is Mistasini Primrose. That's a flower I photographed in Minnesota that's usually found further north in Quebec. It just gives you an idea of a lot of these types of organisms don't rely on a lot of soil. It's often just lichens that colonize the soil first, and then ground-hugging species follow that. This is Wasswagoning Bay, northeast Minnesota. That's Mount Josephine. This is Lake Superior. I didn't actually know, this is the same bay that somebody hung up a picture I took in the hallway. I don't know who did that, but I guess I'm thankful. It ended up looking cool. It was nice and big, but it's the same location, a slightly different view. So we're going to look at the future of the Great Lakes and climate. With the warming climate, you tend to naturally think, okay, does that mean a less oligotrophic lake? Oligotrophic is the first stage of a lake's life cycle. So that means very nutrient poor, cold, lacking a lot of organisms. And these are glacial lakes, and they are relatively young in their life cycle. But, so yeah, the inclination, the natural inclination is to think less oligotrophic lakes, right? Well, in some places that's true. In Lake Erie, where you have a heavy influence of agriculture, runoff, nitrogen, and phosphorus increases the algae. And we're going to talk about toxic algae in a sec. But it's a little more nuanced than that, and we're gonna get into that in a minute. But another thing, changing water temperatures and oxygen levels caused by eutrophication might shift distribution of fishes. That also has an impact on the economy. This is a view of Lake Erie in early October, about 10 years ago. Clearly, this is eye-catching, right? This is not it's not completely unnatural, but it's encouraged more and more by warm waters and agricultural runoff, because we're surrounded. Southern Ontario here is all agriculture, as well as northern Ohio. Especially, there's a lot of like manure-related stuff and manure like waste ponds in northwest Ohio. But Lake Erie is the most susceptible to this because it's so shallow, and that leads it to be more warm. And then it's surrounded by agriculture. But this is blue-green algae. It's caused by a cyanobacteria. It's different than green algae, which is not toxic like this is. And this usually occurs in southern lakes, like in Georgia, across the south. But it also occurs in the bays of some of the northern Great Lakes, like Green Bay and Saginaw Bay in Michigan. But it's becoming more common up north because of the warmer waters and the agricultural runoff. And it's important because this can be truly deadly. I mean, we hear about it even in Lake Mendota, when you get a blue-green algae bloom, it's killed dogs, right? And obviously dogs are more susceptible because they drink lake water more than humans do, and they're also smaller in size. But they can actually, once they ingest it, they can actually succumb within minutes, because the algae produces a neurotoxin and then a toxin that attacks your liver. So the neurotoxin actually is kind of like a potent nicotine, so it results in twitching, weakness, seizures, vomiting, and paralysis even. And then the liver issue toxin can cause the animal to hemorrhage to death. So this is important. It is deadly potential to humans, but humans are generally smart enough to not like drink lots of it. So, but like I said, not so fast as far as the oligotrophic lakes things go, because as we know, invasive species have a ginormous impact on our ecosystem. These are zebra mussels, as you're probably well aware of, and then this is what it looks like a native mussel. And zebra mussels have done something incredible, as well as quagga mussels. Quagga mussels are in Lakes Huron and Michigan as well. This is a view of Lake Michigan. But this is beautiful, right? Like, look at how blue it is. It's tropical seeming, no filter. But this is not right. And this is because quagga mussels and zebra mussels, which are both invasive mussels, can filter the entire volume of Lakes Michigan and Huron in as little as 3 days. So they're sucking in all of the native phytoplanktons that the food chain depends on. So this is actually why you've had a crash in the native salmon, it's not a native salmon fishery, but in lake trout and in the introduced salmon fishery, because the fish that these larger fish eat depend on phytoplankton. It's the microorganisms that keep the ecosystem functional from the bottom up. And as a result, you get a cleaner, clearer lake, but in effect, it's biologically dead in many ways, in many parts of the lake, because you're lacking a fundamental piece of the native ecology. There are parts of Lake Michigan you could theoretically walk across the bottom of the lake without touching the ground, because quagga mussels, which live on the lake bed, are so numerous. They number in the billions. But also, mussels regulate phosphorus, which is another potential cause of eutrophication. So, in 2017, a study was done to try to really narrow down the effects of these zebra mussels and quagga mussels on the lake. So what they did is they measured filter feeding intensity, which is essentially a map of, on the top, essentially a map of mussels, invasive mussels in Lake Michigan. So you can see they're more prevalent, kind of near the shore. But you can see the direction that's going, and this is relatively dated. So you can see the number of them is growing and growing and growing. At the same time, the amount of chlorophyll, which can be seen as an analog for phytoplankton population, is shrinking in a perfectly inverse relationship, basically, and you can see some of the more specific areas they pointed out. It's kind of tremendous what they've done and what they're still doing, all because, a ship released ballast water in Duluth Harbor, or someplace in the Great Lakes. So, troubling nonetheless. In 2009, Trump Picas assessed that summer surface water temperatures might increase by as much as 11 degrees Fahrenheit in 2100. So if we just saw that all alpine and Arctic disjunct communities can't really survive in areas where the surface temperature is above 59 degrees Fahrenheit, that might push them all over the edge. So the viability of those populations is threatened. Like I said, fishes depend on certain temperature profiles. You have cold water species that are important in Lake Superior, like whitefish and lake trout, and then species that used to be more important in Lake Michigan, like coho and Chinook salmon. But the habitat that might be created in the future might be more accommodating for the warm water species. So another thing, this was analysis done by Wong in 2010. Look at the average annual ice cover on the Great Lakes over time. There's a pretty clear decrease, at least in the past 40 or 50 years. At the same time, and I will say though that the whole of the Great Lakes rarely freezes over unless it's an extremely, extremely cold year. But the portion of the Great Lakes that does freeze over matters, because as we saw earlier, when you get lake effect snow, the longer the fetch is over the lake, the higher capacity you have for high magnitude lake effect snow events. So the consensus because of that is that you'll get more lake effect snow, but it's not just a projection, it's something that you can see has been happening. So in 2012, Anderson did an analysis, 1961 to 1990, this was the normal annual snowfall in the Midwest. Shift that time period 20 years ahead from 1981 to 2010, and what do you notice? Well, clearly, you have more snow in the lake effect snow belts up here in the upper peninsula of Michigan and even in lower Michigan, even downwind of Lake Erie. But at the same time, notice this. The snow further south, not influenced by the lakes, has decreased over the same period. So this suggests that while the lakes are warming up, causing less ice and more lake effect snow, the prevalence of synoptic snow events over places not affected by the lakes is decreasing as well. And that could be due to the same factor of a warming winter condition. And that is something, the increase in lake effect snow while decreasing synoptic snowfall was noted by Burnett et al. In 2003. So this is an interesting phenomenon. Clearly, the Great Lakes are subject to lots of environmental change. We saw that in the past, they didn't exist. During the Ice Age, after the ice melted, we got large glacial lakes like Agassiz, Algonquian, Duluth, and they settled into the depressions that they are now in today, which are the 5 Great Lakes. But at the same time, we can see how much the environment is poised to change as a result of still a changing climate. So the Great Lakes were formed by climate. They affect the climate of their landscape today with big implications for the life that lives around there, the economies of the communities around the Great Lakes, and looking toward the future, we just saw what can change as a result of in general, a warming climate, and also the advent of, modern industry that introduced invasive species and stuff like that. So, also, this is so pretty. This is in northern Minnesota along the North Shore. This guy's from Ontario though, so he came across the border. But anyways. Let's see. Here are the peer review works that I cited. And so let me leave you with this. Climate is so significant that its variations in the ecosystem that rely on those differences, it's reflected in every single Minnesota state welcome sign. Actually, believe it or not, you have one stripe here, one blob here. This is the transition between the northern coniferous forest to the western prairies. So you have upland prairie here, a deciduous forest here, and then coniferous forest to the northeast, and that's all a result of climate. And since the end of the last ice age, it's been a tug and pull because we have been in periods where it has been warmer than it is now. And that's why even in pollen cores, you can see places up here, you got more like oaks and pines, but now you're settling back into spruce, fir, aspen. But at the same time, if we're going to a warmer climate, this might be pushed forward to the northeast. So maybe signs like this could be a relic, or they'll have to like redesign them to match the conditions on the ground. Here's a beautiful Minnesota mountain lion, and I guess I'll take any questions if you have them.
So we got about about 5 minutes for questions, so maybe three questions? If anyone has any questions for Benji?
I
Yes.
have one question. So when you were showing the entire USA and the southern regions of the USA where there are not the Great Lakes, are you certain that the snowfall that is affected in the southern regions of USA is due to the lakes only, or there might be some other factors?
So you're talking about this map?
Yeah.
So this is the southern parts of Midwest, Missouri, southern Illinois, Kentucky. So I'm saying that let's consider that the climate is warming over an entire region. If that's leading to less lake ice in the wintertime on the Great Lakes, you'll have more opportunities for lake effect snow, which is probably a reason. I mean, we saw the ice was declining over the same time period, and you see more snowfall in the lake effect snow regions. But in the regions not affected by lake effect snow, you saw a decrease in snow over the same time. So that suggests that in a warming climate, you get less chances for synoptic snowfall events because that is what affects these areas, while getting more opportunities for snow in the lake effect regions. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I wanted some clarification. So earlier in your presentation, like Western Michigan, and like Erie, you had the green where it was.
Yeah.
It gets less. Did you say it gets less snow?
Over here?
Yeah.
So this is mapping how cold it gets just in terms of air temperature
Oh, cool.
at the surface in the wintertime. So what this is suggesting is that, so purple in this case means cold,
Yeah.
green means warm. Upwind of the Great Lakes, I mean this is the predominant flow
Yeah.
in the wintertime. Upwind of the Great Lakes without the influence of the warm waters, it's colder. When you get the influence of the warm waters, it's warmer on the land just south of it. So that's all it's saying, is that it doesn't get as cold in areas downwind of the Great Lakes. Even just across Lake Michigan, you have a zone difference of like 1.5 or 2 maybe. So in places in Wisconsin, it's much colder than it is across the lake in Michigan.
So then they get less snow on that side.
Not necessarily, because all this is saying is you're actually getting more snow on this side, and the reason why is because this is just considering extreme minimum temperatures. So while it may get negative 45 up here, it's going to get like negative 10 here at the coldest nights in the winter time. But as long as it's cold enough for snow to fall, you're going to get more snow falling in regions downwind of the Great Lakes. So so that's why in one of these slides I said more lake effect snow up to a point, because more lake effect snow obviously, but if it's too warm for snow period, then it's not going to snow as much. So that's the caveat. Yeah.
I have got one last question if we have time.
Sure.
Yeah. So if we just forecast this maps to the warm warming climate,
Yeah.
when the Arctic is much hotter and much warmer as
Uh-huh.
compared to the now. So the incoming cold flow or the cold front would be much warmer. How do you think that will affect this lake effect and the snow?
Yeah.
If you're
So as long as so I believe it has to be, talk about this in 453 with Angela Rao. The temperature differential, all this is due to temperature differentials between the waters and the air higher in the atmosphere. If the temperature differential is sufficient enough, I believe it's 14 degrees Fahrenheit, then you can get sufficient upward heat and moisture fluxes for lake effect snow to occur. If it wasn't even cold enough for it to snow in general though, then you're not going to get lake effect snow. But yeah, I see what you're saying. If it's warmer up north and you don't get sufficiently cold air, well, it's probably going to be a while before we don't get, I mean, if that ever happens, before we don't get freezing temperatures in the northern Midwest, right? So it doesn't look like that for the foreseeable future. It looks like really, as long as it's cold enough for snow, you're going to get a lot more snow. Yes, Professor Hirsch.
So I guess on the west coast, like you control sea urchins by letting sea otters each other. And it's always interesting to introduce a control organism from somewhere else, but is there something that could chew on the clogging muscles that would be fairly benign?
So you said that sea otters eat.
I think so, but is there something that could take care of the clogging muscles?
So that's been looked at. The problem is that, and people have been like, well, why can't we eat zebra mussels? And it's because they're 1/4 of an inch in diameter and they offer basically no nutrition whatsoever. They're all just calcium carbonate. They're so small and they're so numerous that, yeah, at the moment nothing is eating them. And it's hard for me to picture a sea otter wanting to eat something like that offers no nutrition, but I think that could be something that could be looked at. There's many other invasive species as well. There's sea lampreys that have crawled up the St. Lawrence Seaway that latch on to fish and suck their blood like they're a vampire. So I haven't looked into that as much as I would want to, but that is an interesting thought.
All right, we're gonna have to wrap